When I went to MIT in the fall of 1977, it was a culture shock. I grew up in the Bay Area of San Francisco. Boston, Cambridge was very different than California. Two impressions at MIT. The entire freshman class is just 1,000 students. And when you all gather in September, there's a reception in the great court of MIT along the Charles River. All 1,000 of you are there. There's two memories that you get from that initial meeting of your 1,000 fellow classmates. The president of the university greets you and he says, look to your right, look to your left. Half of you are going to graduate in the bottom half of your class. And while that's mathematically true, it was 100% shocking to all these high-performance kids who were there. The second memory is that rush starts immediately after the freshman reception. The Greek system is integral to MIT. There are 32 fraternities when I was a freshman there, and roughly 40% of all the students live in a fraternity, and MIT implicitly guarantees you 4 years of campus housing. So whether it's in the Greek system or a dormitory, you have housing. So rush begins literally before you have even your first class. I rushed, and as luck often would have it in life, I was pledged by some houses. A couple other houses I had hoped to get into, I wasn't pledged. And when I thought about where I wanted to live, again, this is almost like marriage. It's a decision you're making for your entire undergraduate experience. I slept on it, and the houses that had pledged me, something just didn't feel like this was the right decision. So I opted to move into the dorms, and I ended up in a place called Burton. And the third floor is called the Burton Third Bombers. And I would argue that the Burton Third Bombers were almost a stronger Greek brother and sisterhood than many of the Greek houses on campus. Incredibly rowdy, very strong traditions. Maybe they had their own little bit of hazing. And they didn't have anything except the oral traditions of being passed down from one year to the next. And to this day, the Burton Third Bombers are an incredibly tight organization. So I settled in. I thought this is a pretty good existence. But still, I liked the idea of the Greek system. And in the fall of my sophomore year, fall of '78, MIT had gone out to add a 33rd fraternity. 32 were not enough for 4,000 undergrads. We needed a 33rd fraternity. And Zeta Psi came in and said to MIT, we are the right group to fill that niche of that 33rd fraternity at MIT. MIT said, great, Zeta Psi, have a go at it. Greg McElroy rolls into town doing what he does best, holds a reception announcing a new fraternity. And even back then, as an 18-year-old, I had an entrepreneurial itch in me. And so there was something appealing about not just being in a fraternity, but being a founder of a fraternity and helping establish the culture of what Zeta Psi would be on campus. Greg and I met several times, and Greg's persuasive skills, he persuaded me and said this is the right thing. We became ultimately a core group of 13 guys who became the founding alpha class of the Rho Alpha chapter of MIT. That happened all in the fall of '78, and in '79, we were commissioned, got our charter, and went through the process of becoming brothers in 1979. So here we are starting a fraternity in late fall, through the winter and early spring. So on one hand, you'd say that's great news that we don't have to compete against the marketing messages of all these other fraternities. Other hand, it was horrible news in that nobody's thinking about rushing because it's completely outside the experience of MIT. Everybody's heads down with their technical and engineering studies, and to get people's attention to move away from academics and focus on perhaps starting a fraternity, that was part of the challenge. I said there were 13 of us who were the charter group. It was actually even a smaller number. I believe Greg brought together 6 guys. I was one of the 6. And then we had to basically do a completely self-starting rush to grow that number from 6. You know, when you think about culture, if you have 6 men and you add 1 person, you've increased your population by 16%. If you're at 7 people and you add 1, you're adding it by 14%. So each person has an incredibly disproportionate impact on what the group is going to be. So on one hand, we were very desirous of growing. On the other hand, we were incredibly concerned about what impact would each additional guy have on the culture. Would we have schisms? Would we have people who perhaps would be less interesting that the next great guy would want to join because they say, as Groucho Marx would say, I would never join an organization that would have me as its member. Would somebody say, I would never join an organization that accepted XYZ as a member? So there was this balancing act. I took on the role as rush chairman. And I think I did so because I felt that that was the area in which I could contribute most and perhaps was of greatest import. Because without essentially sales and marketing, because that's what we were doing, was selling an idea, evangelizing, something that didn't exist. We didn't have a house, we didn't have anything. We just had these ideals going back to 1847, but which had never been on the campus of MIT. What did we have as our selling proposition? So we had to create something that drew people in, and I felt being rush chairman was a way I could make a difference. I ended up being rush chairman for my sophomore year, junior year, and senior year. But when I graduated, we were a house of 40 guys, and I think to this day the MIT chapter's been somewhere between 40 and 50 men. I think the question of did Zeta Psi put me on the path of entrepreneurship, I think it continued to validate that that was something that was a natural resonance for me. I had done entrepreneurial things even in high school, but what I think I found is that it was more comfortable for me to be part of starting something than being part of an existing large organization. It just felt more natural. Most folks who have never started a business or thought about joining a startup company have fears. The fears are natural. I have fears every time I start a company. But what you learn after the first time or two is instead of peering, here we are in Niagara Falls, instead of peering over the falls, looking over the cliff below, which is how it feels to start a company before you do it, it's actually more like standing on the curb and you're only jumping off 6 inches onto the street. So after you do it a couple times, the fear becomes less. And I think that was one of the things that helped me at Zeta Psi later in life to say, hey, you can do something that looks impossible, but you know what? It's actually like jumping off a curb. So my commitment to Zeta Psi, why am I doing this well into my 50s? It's 2 reasons. A sense of fair play and karma, and a pay it forward feeling. MIT was ridiculously expensive back in the 70s. I think tuition was $4,000 a year. And I'm sure anyone who's under 25 years old is going to be crying crocodile tears for $4,000 a year tuition. But it was a lot of money back then. And in my junior and senior year, I was working multiple jobs, took on as much debt as possible, and still fell short. And I honestly didn't know how I was going to, between the combination of paying rent, room and board for Zeta Psi, tuition, books, how it was all going to happen. And Greg McElroy and other members of the Zete National Organization encouraged me to apply for a scholarship. I didn't even know there were any. And I, 2 years, received very generous donation of scholarship. Numbers that, if you were to adjust for inflation today, I don't think we match that today. it made a difference. It allowed me to finish graduating in 4 years. Still had a lot of debt, but it actually closed the gap in a very meaningful way. And I always remembered that. So I felt a sense of fair play that if later in life things worked out well for me, that I could pay it forward and believe that there were other young men who today would be similarly situated. And if I could help give something back, both in terms of time, talent, and money, that would be a good thing. So 6 years ago, I was invited to join the Educational Foundation Board. And for 6 years, I've supported that. And it all goes back to the support I got those my junior and senior years in college. I have 3 kids in their 20s, all of whom went to Stanford. Stanford and MIT in some ways have similarities, in some ways are quite different. The piece of advice first I gave them as their dad was, you're going to a college that you chose, don't go there for mom and me. And I would say for anyone, if you're at MIT, hopefully you're there for the right reasons. You're doing it for yourself, not for your parents or to please anybody else. And the earlier in life you learn to make choices that are moral, but you're doing it because they fit who you are, I'd strongly advise that. I also told the kids, you can go to college as many years as you like. I always remember Animal House, where John Belushi's most famous line was, 7 years of college down the drain when he's expelled. And I said to the kids, you can go to college as many years as you like, except I'm only paying for the first 4. And they all graduated in 4 years. So I would say that in today's world, to the extent you can minimize debt that you're carrying upon graduation, it's a good thing. As a business person, debt is sometimes called leverage, and leverage can be your best friend and your worst enemy. And leave some dry powder. Don't take on as much debt as you think you can, because it gives you degrees of freedom if you're not in hock. If you can get an MIT education, it's worth the investment. It's worth taking on debt. Just don't strangle on debt. I would strongly recommend that. Last but not least is Mark Twain said, don't let your schooling get in the way of your education. And I think a lot of what one learns happens outside the classroom. For me, I needed a normal social life. Growing up in California, it didn't always feel normal living in Boston. And for me, it was getting out to Wellesley. I was in the Wellesley Junior Show 3 years, which is a stage play that's put on by the junior class. Each year they write the play, but they need guys to be in it too. And for me, that was very much fun to do something totally different, which was being a stage play. And I also took classes at Wellesley. And you could smirk and say, oh yeah, you had ulterior motives. But honestly, it was much more interesting to take a class on psychiatry, psychology, sociology, where I was maybe the only guy with 30 women in the class, and getting a totally different perspective on learning and insight. And I think it's great to take classes completely outside of being useful. There's no such thing as useless information because it helps you think better. And so I would say pursue fun and pursue learning as a joy.